Clark County is named for William Andrews Clark, a fascinating character born in a Pennsylvania log cabin, who grew to become a prospector, a banker, a copper baron who made most of his money from mines in Montana and Arizona, a U.S. senator forced to resign in disgrace, and an art collector. After Mr. Clark's first wife died at the age of 50, Mr. Clark met a dancer 39 years younger than he and married her. Together they had 2 children, including Huguette Clark, who is the primary focus of this book, Empty Mansions. Today we are talking to the authors, NBC reporter Bill Dedman and the son of a cousin to Huguette, Paul Clark Newell Jr. Thanks for joining us. Bill, set the stage for us. Tell us about Mr. Clark. He wasn't born into wealth, was he?
No. W.A. Clark was, in a way, the archetypal American success story. Born in a log cabin, but not a poor family, in western Pennsylvania. Went off at the time of the Civil War, perhaps for gold, perhaps to avoid the upcoming draft, but went off at the time of the Civil War to the west, to Colorado, and then up to Montana. Made money as a merchant, a little money in gold, as a banker, and developed eventually ownership of the richest copper mines in the world, in Montana and in Arizona. Was a United States senator, had what you would say a colorful business and political career.
I was really impressed when I read your book that, he just took 3 books with him. One of them was a geology book. This is as a prospector heading west for the first time. And then he went back to school because he didn't realize he knew enough.
Yeah, it's sort of surprising that faced with ownership of mines, Clark was very cautious. He was a go-getter, he was ambitious, but he wasn't foolish. And he realized that taking his family back east, and when he had small children, he was in his 30s, and going back to college for a year, just 1 year, at Columbia University School of Mines. I doubt anyone ever got more bang for a tuition buck than W.A. Clark. And he learned how to test the ore from the copper, and learned that these mines in Butte, Montana were likely to be very profitable, and he went back and invested in it.
So he goes back to Butte and tell us what life was like back there for him.
Well, he was a developer of the community. I mean, he was building the railway, the streetcar, the water facilities, the biggest bank in town, owner of the mines. It wasn't a company town. There were competing owners, but he was developing a dusty town into one that was one of the leading cities of the West. Now, you wouldn't name it if you were guessing what were the 10 biggest cities in the West in the 1880s. You'd forget Butte.
So he, when I read the book, his life up to that time looked pretty good. He seemed to have it all, but he was missing one thing, wasn't he? He was missing a title.
Yes. W.A. Clark had an ambition to be a United States senator. And he kept being repulsed by the people of Montana and by the legislature, which may have been because of political corruption by his opponents. There was a lot of money flying around when it was time to vote to choose senators to send to Washington. But after several failures for a seat in Congress or in the Senate, he finally was elected. And then he gets to Washington and he can't get seated because of a challenge that he had paid or bribed legislators to vote for him. And there was a lot of evidence that legislators had gone to begin the session owing debts, and by the end of the session they had money in their pocket. Or the bank to which they owned the money had been purchased by W.A. Clark. There was now attached to his name some scandal that he was never able to brush off.
One of our famous characters is Mark Twain in Nevada history. Mark Twain called Mr. Clark coarse and vulgar, but he had a conflict, didn't he?
Well, first, I think Paul can speak to this as well, but W.A. Clark was not coarse or vulgar.
His manners were impeccable. He adopted the manner and stature of a prominent diplomat, such as being a U.S. senator, long before he actually got that office. So Mark Twain was, I think that there was an element of envy on the part of on the part of Mark Twain. He coveted the idea of having great homes and great wealth, and he invested in a number of fly-by-night kinds of investors, quick, rich types of scams, and So I think that he envied what Clark had achieved in terms of wealth and in terms of building the most expensive house in the country in the early 1900s, whereas Mark Twain had to borrow from time to time. He was always pressed to go back on the road with his road show because he was out of funds and was in danger of losing his properties.
And the conflict was that Mark Twain, or Samuel Clemens, had been rescued from bankruptcy by a man named Henry Rogers, who was really number 2 at the Standard Oil Company with John D. Rockefeller. And what was the Standard Oil group trying to do during those years in the early 1900s? They were trying to take over the copper business in Montana. And talking down W.A. Clark and his properties was in Samuel Clemens' interest in regard to his business as a person who'd made money in copper, and in terms of his friendship with Henry Rogers. We're not the only ones, I think, to reach the conclusion. There's a new autobiography of Twain, a second volume of his autobiography, and the editors comment in there that it certainly appears that his hatred of Clark, his criticism of Clark as a man who should have a ball and chain, and everyone knows it, that criticism seems to have been at least amplified by his friendship to the man who had rescued him from bankruptcy. You know, people often remember W.A. Clark as a robber baron, but he was not in business a person who played outside the rules, and he was never one to, for example, profit from stock manipulation, but Mark Twain was.
Well, and that was one of the takeaways from this book. I thought clearly the scandal in Congress besmirched his reputation, but he had a reputation, you note in his book, as being a very good businessman, upstanding, fair, treated his employees well.
And had relatively good union relationships, much better than the other mine owners, and was in favor of having women have the right to vote, etc. Now, there was a political advantage being for an 8-hour workday, for example. You might get the union vote. So there's some blurring of the line. But it does appear that W.A. Clark was honest in business, and that his success as a builder of the West was forgotten, I think, because of the political taint.
Talk a little bit about that and his role in shaping Las Vegas.
Well, his main role in connection to Las Vegas, and of course why he had the county named after him, was because he needed to stop on his railroad. He built the railroad out of his own pocket, connecting Los Angeles to Salt Lake City as a way of connecting to the rail lines to the east. His goal was to open up Los Angeles and the port as a connecting point to the Orient. At that point, Los Angeles was a tiny town compared with its neighbor to the north in San Francisco. And his goal was to bring what it seemed clear, I think, to many people in Los Angeles it needed, which was this port and this rail connection. And he financed it. Los Angeles just happened to be a place where he needed a watering stop, a place for timber, for water, for refreshing the trains on their way. And he had extra land to sell off.
Let's take this story a little bit further, and I really want to hear some of your stories too, as it relates to Aget. Mr. Clark's first wife, Kate, passes away at the age of 50. What happens to life for Aget and at that point?
Well, now this is the first family.
This is the first family,
right? So what you have is W.A. Clark at that point is a widower with grown children, children between 16 and on toward 30, and. At that point, he was also beginning to build the biggest house in New York City. Now, he may have already had a connection soon after his first wife died with Anna, who became the second wife, a young woman he'd met in Butte in the theater. But she went off to Paris. I think she's often remembered as though she was the teenage bride, but let's be honest, she was 23 by the time they got married. They had 2 daughters. While he's serving in the United States Senate, he announces, I didn't tell anybody before, but by the way, I've been married now for 3 years, and 2 years ago we had a daughter. That's Huguette's older sister. So eventually, he's a man in his 60s. He now has two young daughters and a wife 39 years younger than he, and he's starting a new family at that point, while he's also starting a new railroad and starting new business ventures. very surprising for a man of that age in that time.
Tell us about Los Angeles. So this family played a big role in its development.
Los Angeles was, the next point of great interest for Senator Clark. He was essentially pretty well. He still owned mines after the turn of the century, but he had been in the Senate for most of that time, immediately after the turn of the century. And his family had many of his siblings had joined with him in the Butte area, and it was a close family. So they began to emigrate into Southern California to get to better weather and a little more civilization. But Clark, of course, was headed the other direction to New York City. But he took an interest in Southern California as well, and one of his brothers with whom he was a business partner in many ventures was J. Ross Clark. And Clark often brought to his brother opportunities in California. And he had a lot of trust in his brother and did make a number of investments there. And he brought to his brother, Ross brought to W.A. An opportunity to buy a couple of small railroads that just served the suburban areas around the core area of Los Angeles. And looking at the prospects there, they decided that it might be worthwhile to explore the idea of purchasing these railroads, tying them together, and then moving them 1,000 miles away to Salt Lake City. And as Bill alluded to, that was to essentially accomplish in the early 19th century, which we later came to be called the Pacific Rim as an area of opportunity. So he was a visionary, and he saw early on that being able to open up the Los Angeles harbor would be a sensational way of making the contact necessary with the lines that led to the East Coast. And in spite of the fact that it traveled through essentially 1,000 miles of desert, and which, as the banker friends that he spoke with took a dim view of, that they thought, well, why would you want to build 1,000 miles of railroad when there's nobody living there? But he was looking beyond that to the point where Los Angeles would become a major port, and that the Asian market would be something that would be worth exploring. In fact, he even looked into the idea of adding on to the rail interest freighter shipping by steamboats. And so that was a long-term vision, and probably the line didn't make significant money in his lifetime, but by World War II it was a very important line. So his vision was correct. He would come in because his family had mostly, his brothers and sisters and his mother had all emigrated to Los Angeles area. He would come out to Los Angeles at least once a year. He was a close family man with his siblings, and so he'd come out to visit for a period of time every year. And once the railroad was online, which is around 1905, thereafter he came to visit in his own railroad, his own private car, and over the railroad lines that he personally owned. That's a little bit of an exaggeration because, without going into the whole story, ultimately the road was shared, the rights were shared with Harriman, who built the Union Pacific, or who owned the Union Pacific line. But it was always considered Clark's Railroad, and it was commonly referred to both in Los Angeles and in Salt Lake City as the Clark Road or the Clark Line. So after he began to come to Los Angeles in that manner, he was visiting in my parents' home, along with his other brothers and sisters. They gathered there for a dinner and enjoyed a nice opportunity for family visit. And they were having a good time, an entertaining evening. And his valet came to the door of the house, knocked politely, and informed the senator that the train was supposed to have left Los Angeles 20 minutes before. And Clark looked at him with some annoyance and said, well, just hold on, because we're not finished having our meal and our congregation of our family this evening. And so he continued on, and in fact, a trainload of people were kept waiting for at least an hour.
Well, you can
past
do
the
you can do
departure
that when
time.
you own the railroad, I guess,
Exactly.
right? I want to get back to life with Huguette, and she was very close to her mother, her father, but also her sister, and her sister died young.
Yes. So Huguette and her older sister, Andrea, came to the United States as immigrants to their own country in 1910. Huguette was just 4 years old, her sister 3 years older. And here they are living in the largest house in New York City, 121 rooms for a family of 4 and their servants. And the girls were very close. They were outdoor girls. They were involved in activities but closely supervised by the nannies and the governesses. When Andrea was nearly 17, a week before her 17th birthday, she was on a family trip, got meningitis, died within 4 days on a trip in Maine in the woods. And there's speculation in the family about what effect this may have had on Huguette. I don't think it's a singular key that unlocks the story of why Huguette eventually had her reclusive personality and the like. I don't think it's that clear cut. Huguette was shy even as a young child. But clearly, we can imagine what the effect would have been to lose a close sibling, her only sibling with whom she shared a bedroom until nearly that age.
Clearly they were close from reading the book, but it's almost heartbreaking when you read the account of what happened when her parents read her diary. What did they find out?
Her parents were astonished to learn that their older daughter had been so unhappy and sad as a child. I'm sure they had some hint of it, but they expressed to friends that they were surprised to read of how she had felt closed off in this world of golden rooms and governesses. She had found an outlet for expression and freedom and self-direction through the Girl Scouts. And as a memorial to their older daughter, the W.A. Clark and his wife Anna bought land and donated it as the first National Girl Scout camp in New York State. Thousands of Girl Scouts have attended Camp Andre, they call it, to learn some independence, which she had only a glimpse of before she died.
There's also a memorial to Andre in Santa Barbara. Describe the estate there.
So the Clarks had a summer home from 1923 on, renting and then owning, in Santa Barbara on a cliff overlooking the Pacific, 23 acres, 20,000 square foot house, rebuilt the house after the Santa Barbara earthquake. And there is off in the formal garden a thatched roof English cottage, which had been owned by the previous owners and had their daughter's name on it, and the Clarks took it down and called it Andre's Cottage. The young woman who was the daughter of the caretaker, the estate manager, who used to play with Huguette, described how everyone would stay very quiet around there. So it was like a playhouse for the children, but Huguette was now in her 20s. It was also something of a shrine or a memorial. And in the house, Paul's been in the house at Bel Sguardo, there are many paintings of the two daughters. The spirit of this deceased sister who never lived in that, never visited that house, is everywhere on the walls at Bel Sguardo.
Mm-hmm. Let's jump ahead to Huguette's later life. She ends up spending the last years of her life in a hospital in New York. How did that come to be?
Well, Huguette was, I think, shy, interested in her art, in her painting. Her mother was quite reclusive, and the two of them, living in separate apartments in a building on Fifth Avenue next to Central Park, really didn't go out much after the 1930s. And Huguette was known to go out some in the 50s. She'd go get her violin, her Stradivarius restrung. But they were very quiet and private. I think they had their fears, fear of kidnapping, for example, fear of people taking advantage of them. And after her mother died in 1963, we're not aware of Huguette going out after that. And so she had been alone in this apartment for many years. She ultimately got some skin cancers, some cancers on her face, and was actually near death because these were untreated. And so she went into the hospital, got fixed up. And then she said she wanted to stay. She felt more comfortable there. And she ended up, she was now in her mid-80s. And she ended up staying more than 7,000 nights, 20 years in the hospital until she died nearly 105. And I think the decision to go into the hospital makes some good sense. She was in her 80s. She's rattling around in 42 rooms in 3 apartments with paintings by Monet and others. A lot of valuable items to be there when you're just one person by yourself. She'd had an intruder. That decision, I think, made some sense. Most of us would be very surprised that she would choose to live in the hospital, but she didn't like nursing homes, she said.
Paul, you had a lot of conversations with her over the years. What do you make of all this?
Well, we've tried to tell as much as we can about Huguette, and we did a tremendous amount of research in getting to that point. But we've been very careful not to draw conclusions or to categorize her. Maybe that's out of Bill's area of knowledge and experience, and mine as well.
But you kind of touch upon some different themes of possibilities in the book, right? I mean,
well, clearly there was a very strong relationship with her mother, and when that bond was broken by death, it probably was a factor in her trend into reclusion. But the interesting thing to me, after I established contact with her, and I was one of only 2 people related to her that had that kind of access, from the moment of my first conversation with her and throughout that time in which I had regular contact with her, I would have to say she was a very normal person. That's what she conveyed to myself.
what was her demeanor like?
Well, of course I couldn't see her, but we were talking on the phone. And I think that emboldened her in a way where she may have been much freer in her conversation with me and knowing me in that way, rather than if, let's say, I'd walked into her hospital room. I think she might. I'm only guessing here, but I think she was very comfortable in situations where she had complete control.
And she did. She never even gave you a phone number, right?
That's correct, yeah.
So how did that work?
Well, the first year after I had called her, she responded immediately with a telephone call, but she left me no phone number. And ultimately, I talked to her attorney. I said, she's called several times now and caught me away from the house each time she's called, and I'd be happy to call her back if she would give me her telephone number. He said, she's not going to give you your number. So what we established with her attorneys after that was that I would call them, request a call from her, specify a time and date, and she would always respond just exactly as requested and always promptly. And we had a number of conversations over the years. Sometimes it would just be a checkup to see, well, how are you, that sort of thing, and sometimes it was a topic that would take us into, a half hour or maybe even more of genuine conversation. And the thing that stands out, I think she was about 88 when I first talked with her, and close to 100 when I last spoke with her, was that throughout that time she was always lucid, she was always completely articulate. She was a good conversationalist. We had nice visits. And there was nothing that one could draw from those conversations that would suggest that she's even peculiar, or that her interests are odd, or the fact that she doesn't welcome you into her home. Those things are not easily explained.
These initial conversations, you didn't even realize she was calling from a hospital, did you?
I didn't actually learn that until after the conversations had stopped, and then Bill, through a different channel, was able to find out that she was in a hospital. And I had known that for a few years, I guess, but it was those of us who knew her and were related to her were reluctant to invade her privacy. So even though I was aware of it, I was surprised, frankly, when I found out, because many of our conversations, I pictured her in her great apartment on Fifth Avenue. I did puzzle, why wouldn't she have a butler or a secretary to screen her calls?
Yeah, and there must have been suspicions that potentially she was being taken advantage of.
A lot of that we learned later, after she had passed on, and the wills there were 2 wills in conflict with each other, but that began to raise lots of questions. And Mr. Deadman here was responsible for a lot of that.
Well, part of what fueled that was her generosity. See, what we knew on the outside before we started working on this book was Her nurse has received millions of dollars in gifts and several houses. Her attorney and her accountant are named in the will. A lot of things that would naturally lead you to believe that this woman has secluded herself and made herself vulnerable to being taken advantage of. Once you dig into it, once we read the documents, once we talk to everybody, it seems clear that what was happening was that Huguette was so relentlessly generous. Now, you can argue the ethics of whether her nurse should have accepted the gifts, but it's clear that Huguette wrote these checks, 300 checks in her own hand. There's no evidence of any arm twisting. And she was selling property, a Stradivarius violin, artwork, etc. She was selling that property and in selling the house, which drew that sale of an empty house is what first drew me to the story, because she was house poor. She owned these great mansions, but she was giving away the cash, and the tax bill was coming in for those gift taxes faster than she could keep up.
And she was right to be suspicious. People were pressuring her for money, weren't they?
Yes.
The hospital in particular.
Yes. The hospital tried. It's amusing, I think, and some would choose a sharper word, the efforts that the hospital made. When the hospital president's mother is coming to sit with you, writing you letters, sending you gifts, then you know that you're being cultivated for gifts. And she mostly withstood that. She did surprise the hospital at one point with a painting. She gave a painting by Manet that the hospital sold for $3.5 million. But in the end, the hospital got $1 million from Huguette in the will.
A lot less than they thought they'd get.
Yes, out of more than 300 million that she died with. And during the last 6 years of her life, she gave the hospital nothing. She'd signed that will. I think we have to give Huguette more credit than you would have assumed. She, as you can hear in her conversations with Paul, I'm not sure everybody knows that in the audio book, the audio version from iTunes or Audible, you download, you play it on your iPad or whatever device you like, you can hear Paul and Huguette talking. You can hear their conversations. She remembered having tickets on the Titanic in 1912. She knew the name of the hotel at Waikiki that she stayed at in 1915. As clear as a bell. We should all be so lucky as to be approaching 100 with such a clear memory.
You know, Huguette was really generous, and to the point where she really needed to raise some cash. So tell us what she did.
Oh, so one of the items she sold ended up back here in Las Vegas in the early 1990s, we believe. She sold a Renoir painting called In the Roses. It's a portrait of a woman on a bench in a garden. She sold it, and the buyer was Steve Wynn, your casino builder. It's not on public view now, so it wasn't in the years that she owned it for 60, 70 years, and it's not where we can see it now. We do have a photograph of it, but it's a shame that some of this art has stayed out of the public view. But she sold that to raise money so she could give more gifts to her nurse and to her best friend. She gave $10 million to her best friend and social secretary. Huguette was getting into her 90s, and it seems clear that she realized she wasn't going to live forever, and she liked giving money to the people she knew, she was close with, and that she could see them enjoy it.
I appreciate you joining us. Really great stories, excellent book here. If you haven't seen it yourself or you want to pick it up, it's called Empty Mansions, The Mysterious Life of Huguette Clark and the Spending of a Great American Fortune, available now. Thanks again for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.